Hi, I'm Tracy Harris from the Agency of Education. I've been there at the agency for about 1.5 years now, and I work in behavior supports for schools. I'm joined by Ken Kramberg from the Vermont BEST team, and he also does consulting around the state. He has a long career working with students who have emotional and behavioral disabilities. So this is part 2 of a webinar, and hopefully if you're joining us today, you also joined us for part 1, which was the assessment part of the FBA webinar. And if you didn't join us then, hopefully you had a chance to view that webinar that is archived. So we don't have tons of time to do lots of reviews, so I'm going to go really quickly through that and just encourage you to ask questions if I'm going too fast. So today's webinar is about how you take the information from the functional behavior assessment to create a behavior intervention plan. The primary purpose of an FBA is to create that individualized behavior intervention plan. A little bit of backdrop for you, and the rationale behind what we're doing is that FBA-driven intervention plans have emerged as an evidence-based practice. There's a growing body of research that's supporting this as a very best practice, and really what is being considered contraindicated is to develop behavior intervention plans without having first done the FBA. By doing this, you improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of behavioral interventions. The whole idea behind the practical FBA training that we've been doing throughout the state is about scaling down to scale up. And what I mean by that is that we're taking the mystery out of FBAs, because really for students with mild to moderate behavioral disabilities, you don't need someone with that special expertise. This can be a team-driven practice that is conducted by staff within the school with support from parents and other interested parties, and it can be efficient and effective as long as you're not dealing with students at the top of the pyramid who have very complex behavioral issues. We received a training grant at the Agency of Education, and back in November we brought in a professor from Portland State University. And what we did was we provided a training of the trainers event for 60 school personnel throughout the state. And they received training in how to conduct these practical FBAs and to then use the FBAs to create behavior intervention plans. And the agreement for all those 60 participants was that they would then in turn go back to their school districts and train an additional 10 people at least. So what we've done is we have infused the state of Vermont with potentially up to about 600 people who should be trained to conduct these processes. I should have mentioned that I'm fighting a cold right now, and if I lose my voice or start coughing, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Ken, and I apologize if I burst your eardrums in the meantime. So the other thing I wanted to say about, before we get started about behavior intervention plans, is that the behavioral interventions it's about redesigning the school environment and not redesigning the students themselves. When we talk about PBIS and when we talk about positive behavior plans, what we're doing is we're defining what the adults will do. A behavior plan really describes what we will do differently and not as much what the student will be doing differently, besides learning more appropriate behaviors. So it's all about what we will do to help the student learn more effective and efficient behaviors. Just in terms of the context, what we're talking about in terms of basic FBAs and BIPs, we're talking about behaviors and functions that are easily defined and easily identified. We're talking about students who are not showing very complex behaviors, who are not showing dangerous behaviors. We're talking really about those students in the targeted area of the PBIS pyramid. And when we get to the top of that pyramid, that's where we might want to reserve the FBA process for conducting more complex interventions by someone with special expertise. I'm going to get into that a little bit more in this next slide. Excuse me. So the differences between a basic and a complex functional behavior assessment and the plans that would result would be that the basic FBA is for students with mild to moderate problem behaviors that are not dangerous and do not occur in many different settings. On the other hand, those students that are showing severe problem behaviors that might be dangerous, or those that are occurring in many different settings, those are the ones that should be reserved for the complex FBA. At the basic level, we're talking about a relatively simple and efficient process for behavior support planning. And at the complex level, we're talking about a pretty time-intensive process that involves emergency planning, family-centered planning, and collaboration with outside agencies. Basic FBAs and BIPs can be conducted by a team of school-based professionals along with parents, whereas the complex FBAs would be done also in a team format, but would include someone with more specific behavioral expertise, such as a behavior specialist or a school psychologist. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Ken now.
Okay, good morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the specifics of how we go about doing a simple functional behavior assessment. And I want to just remind you again that the only reason why we ever do a functional behavior assessment is so that to inform a behavior intervention plan. So anytime we do an FBA, that's the first part of the process, and the second part of it is always to design an intervention, a behavior intervention plan, or a student behavior support plan. Those terms are used interchangeably in the literature and applied behavior. And so our objectives are, for today, take a look at this slide, are that we're going to introduce this idea of a competing behavior pathway, which is a very effective evidence-based practice. It's a way of organizing our thinking around the behavior support plan that we're going to develop, that's been used for many years and has been shown to be a very effective tool with a lot of evidence and data to support that. So we're going to introduce the competing behavior pathway and use that to identify the function-based supports that do these things, that help us, first of all, teach positive behaviors that are going to replace the problem behavior. And one of the concepts that we work with here is always that we never propose to anytime we identify a problem behavior, we're always going to identify a replacement behavior that competes with that behavior. So we'll take a look at this as we look through the competing pathway and try to develop this concept a little bit so it's understandable. Well, we want to teach a positive behavior to replace a problem behavior. And we want to use strategies, introduce strategies in this format for preventing problem behavior and develop some tools that help us prompt the positive behaviors that we're looking for, the replacement behaviors. And we're also going to look at ways in which we're specifically going to reinforce the replacement behaviors, and ultimately the target desired behaviors that we're looking for. And the last thing is that we want to look for building in ways that we can specifically and effectively respond when we see the problem behavior by redirecting the student to the replacement behaviors we're identifying, and also by using strategies that minimize the payoff for the child so that they don't find useful and helpful to resort to those behaviors. So we're going to put this in the context using a case study, and we're going to take a look at Morgan here and go through our competing pathway, plugging in some of the information from this study here. So let's take a look at this for a minute, and I'll give you a minute to read it, but I'll also read part of it. So that just want to be clear, we get the main point. Morgan's a 6th grade student. She referred to her teacher for being disruptive, refusing to work, throwing books, papers on the floor, and saying, "This is lame." So we're always going to try to specifically identify in behavioral, observable terms what the behavior is, and those are specific things that we identify for Morgan. And it often occurs when she's asked to write a complete sentence or complete sentences to answer writing prompts in social studies class. And Morgan can verbally answer most questions and successfully in large group discussions. However, she struggles with spelling and sentence construction. After she engages in the disruptive behaviors identified, the teacher sends her to the planning room, and Morgan typically stays there for the remainder of the class period. Her behaviors are most likely to occur when she has recently received negative or corrective feedback about her written work. So let's just take a look at that slide for a minute. So we have that information about Morgan. Okay, now normally when we're developing our behavior support plan or our behavior intervention plan and our competing pathway, we have some of the basic information that we've gleaned from our functional behavior assessment in front of us. So we refer back regularly as we go through this to this information that we determined through our behavior assessment about Morgan. And then we're going to summarize her behavior, and this is the context that we're going to use, the structure for this. We're always going to start with the B, the behavior, which is highlighted there in red or orange. We're going to specifically determine what's the behavior in clear and observable terms. And we're going to take a look at the consequence, what happens right after the behavior in that box on the right. And then we take a look at what happens just before the behavior. What are the circumstances under which that behavior occurs? In this case, we'll take a look at that in the specifics. We have that information. And then we're going to take a look at setting events, which are events that make the behavior more or less likely to occur. They're things that may be removed from the specifics of that environment when we see the behavior, but can occur. For instance, an example of a setting event would be if a child really doesn't have breakfast that morning, or has sleep disruption, or has a conflict with another child on the bus on the way to the school, then those would be considered a setting event. When a child's having a bad day, some of those setting events occur, and we may be more or less likely to see the behavior. Okay, so here's what this looks like as we summarize her behavior. We've identified the behavior first. We always start with the behavior, and that is that we see Morgan refuses to work. She throws books and paper on the floor, makes inappropriate comments. And I just want to be clear that actually in applied behavior terms, we wouldn't even use the word inappropriate so much there. We would actually define that further. So one of the things we identified when we looked at that study a minute ago was that she says, "This is lame." Okay, so we want to be specific about what it is we're looking for so that we know that we're observing the same thing when we do our assessment. And when we look at the behavior that we want to change, we want to be as specific as possible. Okay, so then what happens right after the behavior? Well, we've identified through our FBA that the teacher sends her to the planning room. We believe, and this is our hypothesis, was that she does that to avoid writing tasks, which she finds difficult. Okay. What happens just before that is the antecedent. She's asked to write paragraphs, and in this case also we might be more specific. In this case, it's in social studies class. So noting the environment, and this is really very much environment specific when we're doing a simple behavior intervention plan. We want to be clear on where this is happening. And setting events, well, most recently, when she's received recently negative feedback on her writing, it's more likely to occur. So that becomes a setting event for us. Okay, so so now we're going to develop a plan based on this information, and I'm going to turn this over to Tracy.
Okay. One of the big takeaway pieces of information that we want you to take with you from today's training is that there are 3 essential characteristics that we look for when we are identifying that replacement or alternative behavior. We're looking to make sure that the behavior that we are replacing, or the behavior that is used as the replacement, rather, serves the same function as the problem behavior. So since Morgan is engaging in those behaviors of throwing things and saying this is lame and refusing to do her work, since she's doing that, we hypothesize to avoid doing written work. We want to give her a replacement behavior that also serves that same function as refusing to do the work or avoiding difficult tasks. It's not like we're going to allow Morgan to never write again. Of course we wouldn't do that. And I did notice that there's a question that we received from one of the participants asking if it was possible if Morgan's behavior would be caused by an undetected learning disability. And absolutely, because what we read about Morgan is that she's absolutely able to answer questions successfully in the verbal form when she's participating in group discussions. So more than likely, she does have some written language deficits, and those should and would be looked at by the team further, or maybe she's already receiving services for that. Today, however, what our focus is on is eliminating those disruptive behaviors that are causing her to be unsuccessful in social studies class and possibly disrupting learning for others, for her peers. So while in other areas of her life, Morgan will be receiving support on her written language deficits, we're going to focus our plan here and now on replacing those problematic behaviors with behaviors that can be more appropriate for her. So back to the essential characteristics. We want to use a behavior, give her a replacement behavior that serves the same function, which was to avoid tasks. We also, in order for this plan to be effective, the behavior that we give her as a replacement is going to have to be easier for her to do than the problem behavior was. So an example of something that would not be easier than throwing books or saying this is lame would be for her to complete 5 questions first and then ask if she can go visit the planning room teacher. That would be much more difficult for Morgan to do. So that behavior plan would not likely succeed because it's much easier and efficient for her to just throw things and say this is lame, and guess what? Free ticket out of class and out of doing the assignment. So we're going to replace that behavior with something that serves the same function. We're going to replace it with something that's easier to do. And of course, we are going to replace it with something that does not make her ostracized socially. So we want to have a socially acceptable replacement behavior for Morgan. Moving on to the next slide. I'm going to look at each of the things that, each of the components of the FBA and talk a little bit more about what we're going to do as the adults in Morgan's world to help change things. Ken mentioned that when we're doing the FBA, we always look at the behavior first. And when we're looking at behavior intervention planning, it's not as necessary to start with the behavior first. And in fact, what we might want to do is to look at the things that come before the behavior and see what we might be able to do to eliminate that behavior from happening in the first place. So when we talk about manipulating setting events or those things that make the behavior more likely to occur, we're just talking about neutralizing or eliminating those setting events. And we can't always do that. If Morgan forgot to take her medicine that morning, it's not like we can press rewind and make sure that she gets that pill an hour before arriving. We get her when we get her in the state that we get her. But looking forward to future planning, if that seems to be a pattern that Morgan is arriving at school without having taken her meds, then we might want to look at having Morgan receive her morning meds first thing in the morning when she comes to school. That might be an example of how we might manipulate a setting event so that we can neutralize it. When we look at, and I'm going to give you more examples, I'm just doing an overview now. When we look at manipulating the antecedents, what we're talking about is adding relevant things and removing irrelevant triggers in Morgan's world, or more appropriately in social studies class for Morgan. What we're doing is we're looking at taking away those triggers in order to prevent her behavior from occurring. Now, the most important thing that we need to do, if in fact those manipulations of her environment don't work, is that it is our responsibility and what we are owning as the adults in her world by conducting this FBA and devising a BIP. We are owning the fact that we need to teach Morgan alternative behaviors. And I'm going to say it now in case I don't say it later, because I don't think that the slides reflect this as much as they should. This is going to mean that we are going to need to provide Morgan with lots and lots and lots of practice. We're going to model for her. We're going to prompt her. We're going to give her pre-corrections. We're going to reinforce for her every time she uses the alternative behaviors. It's just as we would when we are teaching Morgan an academic skill. We are going to teach her these alternative behaviors using instructional methodology. So again, we're going to teach her that alternative behavior, and again, that alternative behavior is going to be more efficient for her. It's going to be based on the function of her problem behavior, and it will be a socially appropriate alternative that we give her. Lastly, we're going to look at how we might manipulate consequences. What we learned was that Morgan's teacher in social studies was sending her out of class into the planning room whenever she said, "This is lame," and threw her things on the floor. And that was maintaining that behavior, because if our hypothesis is correct, Morgan was getting a payoff for acting in that way. We were actually reinforcing a negative behavior by allowing her to avoid that task. So what we want to do now in our behavior intervention plan is to remove those ineffective reinforcers and add more effective reinforcers that match the purpose of her behavior. Again, I'll get into more detail as we go along. But I see a question. Let's see. Some parents report that some elementary schools regularly call to have them pick up their child due to misbehavior. Does this mean that the BIP is not working and needs a higher level of FBA? That's kind of a loaded question. So I would absolutely say that if a behavior intervention plan has been implemented and still the student is regularly escalating their behaviors to the point where they're being asked to leave the school, that is not working. And I don't know that you need to move it to a complex FBA at that point because, as we discussed, our FBA is about forming a hypothesis. And it could be the fact that our hypothesis was wrong. So before moving it up to the level of getting in a specialist, which could take a long time and cause more call for more resources, we might just want to go back to the table and look again. Ken, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I did.
Okay.
Just one point that I want to make, and it's something that we actually have to remind people of regularly when we start implementing any kind of new behavior intervention or behavior support plan. It's actually one of the concepts we work from is that things almost always get worse before they get better. So when you target a behavior that a student is comfortable with, that they've been using over a period of time, it works for them, and you substitute a different behavior and you're reinforcing them in a different way, usually what you find is actually there's going to be a spike in the behavior. And it's one of the reasons why people that are not very well experienced or not being coached well or teams that are not knowledgeable kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. They'll say, see, we tried this for a couple of days. It was a bad idea. It's not working. And that's what we see parents get called to pick up their child because things have even gotten worse. And that actually is a very common experience. In fact, I'd have to say that in the majority of cases when we target a behavior and we put in a substitute behavior for many, many kids, we see a spike in the behavior. And so that's really an education issue. It's one where we have to educate and support everybody on the team so that they're able to see the interventions through. And it doesn't mean that the behavior intervention plan was a bad plan. It doesn't mean that we need to do a different kind of a functional behavior assessment. It means that we have to stick with the plan and support the adults who have to see it through for a significant period of time. And generally we say 4 to 6 weeks is really a period of time in which when you start a new behavior intervention plan, you're going to need to stay the course before you really try to evaluate and determine whether it's really going to be effective intervention.
Okay, thanks, Ken, for saying that. Right as I turned the microphone over to you, I was predicting what you were going to say. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use Morgan as our example, and I'm just going to give you some examples of how we might conduct some manipulations of her environment. And I see that I've kind of gotten my slides mixed around a little bit. So I'm going to go to, yes. So the slide that's up now is, although it says manipulating the antecedents, what we're really talking about now are the setting events. I just put the wrong title on there. So when we're talking about the setting event being that Morgan has just recently received some critical feedback about her writing and that's more likely to cause her to engage in that problem behavior, what we might want to do is to build in a check-in so that Morgan can meet with an adult with whom she has a positive relationship after she's gotten that type of feedback and before she's going to be asked to do some additional written work. Or another idea that we might want to build in is to have Morgan be able to engage in a fun activity that might allow her to turn her day around before we ask her to move on to the next writing task. So that's those are two examples of how we might manipulate setting events. Now I have to go backwards. Yes. So now again, I apologize. Even though it says manipulating setting events here, what I'm talking about now is how we might manipulate the antecedents, or those things that happen right before Morgan engages in her problem behavior. So the antecedent that we've determined is that she is being asked to do a difficult task, such as writing paragraphs or full sentences for social studies. So instead of giving Morgan the usual assignment, what we might consider is giving Morgan an assignment that she can be more successful with, such as answering with short answers instead of paragraphs, or providing her with prompts and supports that allow her to be more successful, giving her, for example, a paragraph template. So that's how we might manipulate the assignment for Morgan, and I just wanted to remind you that the class is not English or language arts that she's having trouble in. In that class, we would be specifically looking for Morgan to improve her written skills. But we're talking about social studies class where we've already identified that Morgan is very skillful at answering those questions verbally. So if what we're really trying to get at is having Morgan answer or demonstrate her comprehension of the content, it may be very acceptable to provide her with alternative assignments such as shorter answers or templates, or even allowing her to dictate her responses or to answer orally or pictorially. But the other thing that we want to do at this stage is we want to give Morgan some pre-corrections and prompts that will remind her and cue her to use the alternative behavior. So I will return to that, but what I want you to know right now is that when we give Morgan an alternative behavior and when we've taught that to her, then we want to provide her beforehand with some prompts and cues. Morgan, we're going to move now to a writing task, and I just want to remind you that we know that this is frustrating for you, so now is the time when you might want to consider using X, Y, or Z, whatever we've defined as the alternative behavior. So let's move on to that next behavior. And this is where we are going to teach Morgan the behavior. But before we do that, I'm going to conduct a survey. So I want to check your memory now, and I want to ask you, and are they going to be able to, yes, just write in your chat box, what are the 3 essential characteristics of the replacement or the alternative behavior? Remember, I discussed 3 things that we want to make sure that we're considering when we give Morgan an alternative behavior to replace those less effective, well, they're actually quite effective for Morgan, but to replace those disruptive behaviors. All right, I'm going to stop talking and give you time to type in your responses. All right. Let's give you a little bit more time. See that several of you have answered the question, and I'm going to move ahead because I don't want to run out of time. So, answer is, we want to make sure that the alternative behaviors that we give Morgan serve the same function as the problem behavior. We want to make sure that the replacement behavior is easier to do or is more efficient to do than the problem behavior. And we want to make sure that the behavior we give her is socially acceptable. So great job, everyone, on remembering those 3 essential characteristics. All right, so I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to talk about how we might teach Morgan a more appropriate behavior. what the team might want to consider is teaching Morgan to raise her hand and ask for a break instead of throwing things or refusing to do the work or to say this is lame. By teaching Morgan an easier alternative behavior to get what she wants, which is to avoid the written task, we're making that problem behavior inefficient. She will need a lot of practice, as I've mentioned. She will need pre-corrections and prompts to help her get into the habit of using this behavior. But in the end, if our plan works and if we reinforce it appropriately, we will see an end to the disruptive behavior, and we will see Morgan continuing to get that need met, and that need is to avoid this difficult task of writing, and she will no longer disrupt the learning environment. So, going back to the antecedent, before we give Morgan a written task in social studies, we are going to say, Morgan, I want to remind you that you have the option to raise your hand and ask for a break at any point during the next 5, 10, 15 minutes while we're working on this written assignment. If it's too hard for you, if it's too frustrating for you, Morgan, all you need to do is raise your hand, and I will absolutely give you permission to go talk to Mrs. Smith in the planning room. Now, I know that a lot of people may say, well, wait a minute, how is that really teaching her to be more effective in social studies class? How's that going to be really, how's that going to teach her to be a productive member of that social studies community? And what my answer to that is that it's baby steps. This will not be the end of Morgan's behavior intervention plan. We will shape that behavior. Once we get her to the point where she realizes that she can use a socially appropriate behavior to get her needs met, then we'll make it more difficult for her. Maybe after she's proven to us over a period of time that she's able to inhibit that initial lashing out behavior of throwing books and instead just quietly and politely raising her hand or giving her teacher a signal that she needs a break, then maybe we will ask her to, you know what, Morgan, we're going to change things now, and what we want you to do is we want you to first make an attempt for 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes, if you're still frustrated, then we're going to allow you to raise your hand and go take a break. It's all about shaping the behavior, and we'll get there, and Morgan will get there. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Ken now, and he's going to talk about how we might manipulate the consequence strategies.
Okay, so when we talk about the consequences of things that have really occurred right after the behavior that have really helped to maintain those behaviors, we need to think about our strategy as to how we're going to change the consequences at that stage to try to eliminate the problem behavior and apply some consequences that will actually reinforce some of the alternative and desired behaviors that we're going to look at. We're going to get that in a couple of minutes, so we really look at the whole picture here. But we're taking each one of these boxes, each one of these stages, one step at a time to break it down. So what we want to do is make sure that we don't allow the problem behavior to pay off in the same way for the student. We want to be able to put the problem behavior on what we call extinction, phase it out by reinforcing a differential and competing behavior, the desired behavior and the alternative behaviors that we're going to come up with. So now, just yesterday I was consulting in a school and we were talking about how we do this, and it also involved a very similar kind of a scenario to Morgan's with a child when he was posed with some tasks. There was some sensory issues for him, as well as that he was challenged by some of the work, and so he engaged in some undesirable behaviors in order to leave to be directed to leave the room and to go to a planning room. And one of the things that we were able to do with that child, and this really was very much, at the stage of the consequence strategy, at the point at which the teacher started to engage with him and was talking about having him leave the room, we had already determined the child was really quite bright and verbal, and so what we built into his plan was that we would just say to him, in the past, Stephen, this is what you've done, and at this point, usually what happens is you start doing this behavior, I send you to the planning room. So that's not really going to work because it's not really helping you be successful, and it's not helping me be very successful. So we're going to do something else. So, and while the staff was a little bit incredulous that really that was going to be an important step, they tried it, and it ended up being very effective because we were just very direct. We brought the kid into the plan. So we'd come up with a different plan for you. And so this is the pattern we've both been engaging in. So we're going to change that a little bit. So it was really a consequence strategy here. What we want to do is not allow the problem behavior to pay off for the student in the same way. And often we can engage with the students very directly around that and let them know what we're doing. We want to make sure that the alternative behavior that we then propose that the child does, that say instead of doing that and making those noises and throwing things and having me have you leave the room, we're not going to do that anymore. And so here's something else that you can do. And I want to see you do that, and then we're going to come up with and then we're going to reinforce you for that. So we want to make sure that we're really not allowing Morgan, in this case, to avoid the written tasks when she throws a tantrum and disrupts. And so we're going to use some prompts here again as we do at each one of these stages. We're going to prompt her to raise her hand, reward her for raising her hand, and asking for a break, and that's an appropriate way to leave the room. And over time, we're going to shape that behavior, as you're going to see. So by not providing her with what she wants at that point, when she throws a tantrum, we're going to make the problem behavior ineffective. It's not going to work for her anymore. And instead, we're going to reinforce an alternative behavior that competes with that makes it more likely that we're not going to see the problem behavior and we're going to see the alternative behavior in her case. So here's what the whole thing looks like, though. We probably should have started with this. This is really what a complete behavior pathway looks like, a competing pathway. So you have the behavior, and we always have ultimately what it is we're looking for is really the desired behavior, the best of all possible worlds. Morgan was doing really well up with the class when she gets the prompt to do her written work. She engages in the work, completes the writing assignment in the time that's allotted and allowed, and as a result of that, she gets praised by the teacher. She completes her assignment in less time, her grades improve, and her written work is displayed, which is very commonly what we do with kids' work when they do exemplary work. So we recognize, however, that, for a child who has a difficult behavior, like some of the ones that Morgan has done, and they work for over a long period of time, we're probably not going to get to that target, to the desired behavior right away. And so what we're going to do is we're going to end up substituting an alternative behavior, something that gets us part of the way there that's going to help us shape the behavior over time. And one of the questions we often have to ask ourselves and to ask the adults we're working with is saying, we know what it is we want from this child. That's pretty clear. But that is probably unrealistic that that's going to happen immediately. What we need to do is shape the behavior over time. And so one of the questions we often ask is, what can you live with? What can you live with for a behavior that will be less challenging, that will have more positive outcomes for the child, that will give you more opportunities an opportunity to interact in a positive way, praise the child, and bring them closer to the desired behavior that we want. So here's the whole thing here. In social studies class, we're going to, we're going to correct and we're going to prompt Morgan to raise her hand and ask for breaks when we say, class, we're getting to a writing assignment. And for some people in the room, that can be difficult. So one of the things that we know that when people in here are struggling a little bit with writing or having a difficult time with it, then one of the things you can do is you can raise your hand and you can ask for a break when that happens. Okay. And then we're going to see how Morgan does with that. And if she raises her hand and asks for a break, we're going to make sure that we're really on it, that we praise her for practicing that behavior, we're going to be very specific. We might take her aside and say, Morgan, that was great. You raised your hand this time. It's exactly what we're looking for. Be really happy to give you a break, and we're going to work on this because we're going to get you to the point where you're going to be an all-star in class and you're going to be doing your work and completing it, but that was a great job. And we're going to give her a modified writing assignment. So the idea is, and this is what we run into particularly with educators who say, you know, no, she doesn't get to get off the hook, and that's really not what we're looking for. What we want to do is shape the behavior by having her complete a modified writing assignment, something that feels reasonable and manageable for her at this point in time. It gives us an opportunity to really reinforce her for that. So, and then over time, we're going to gradually change the alternative behaviors, and that's part of the detail of our teaching plan. We're going to train her and teach her some other ways in which she can do it so that gradually we get her to complete more writing and to ask for breaks as it's appropriate, and over time we hope we'll need less breaks. Sometimes we do have to consider, you know, child's sensory needs, and that's a very important piece for a child like Morgan, and we may need to really think about regular sensory breaks as part of her program on an ongoing basis. But all these things should bring her closer to the desired behavior. Okay, so
these are just more examples now.
Some examples that we have here of appropriate replacement behaviors that we can take a look at here. Okay, so during an independent reading time in language arts, Audrey calls out. Okay, so we're going to ask you to take a look at this. I'm going to read this first part of it, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us which is the best replacement behavior. Okay, so during independent reading time in language arts, you see Audrey calls out complaints to her teacher, walks around the room. The FBA has shown that the behavior is maintained by gaining adult attention. Okay, so we're going to ask you, this is a survey, we're going to give you a minute to respond, which is the best replacement behavior? Okay, so let's see how we did here.
Most people said C.
Most people said C.
So most people said C, and they would be correct. Okay, so you know, the question we always ask is, does it serve the same function as the problem behavior? And in this case, since we identified that Morgan was acting out in order to gain adult attention, most of you correctly answered C. By requesting help, she's getting direct adult attention. The other question is always, is it easier? Is it more efficient than the problem behavior? And is it socially acceptable? And so requesting adult help appropriately is absolutely socially acceptable. It's quick and easy, and it serves the same function for the child. Okay, so let's take a look at another example here. This is another survey for you listeners out there. When the class is given grammar worksheets at their desk, Ronnie makes animal noises and makes faces at peers. And the function of his behavior is to obtain peer attention. So we're going to give you a minute to answer this. Which is the best replacement behavior for Ronnie? Okay,
No, it's half,
so
it half A, half C so far. Oh wait, mostly A.
So the correct answer would be, and had our respondents do?
A and C.
A and C. Okay, so let's take a look at these. And so we know that the function of his behavior is to obtain peer attention. So which is the best replacement behavior? Well, asking to work with a peer, would that serve the same function as the problem behavior? Presumably it would, because it would get his peer attention. Is it easy and easier to do than the problem behavior? Well, if you think about Ronnie making animal noises, making faces, he's actually going through several different steps. Simply asking, saying, may I work with Stephen, would be very quick and efficient. Asking for a work break, I don't think anybody answered that way. That's great. That wouldn't do it because that would really be for a child who is avoiding work, and that's clearly not the function of Ronnie's behavior. Earning extra recess with peers for finishing work quietly. Okay, so that would meet some of the criteria that we have here. So that would be a good alternative. However, might not be as efficient, and it's going to be recess time is postponed, and so what's going to happen is that we're not really immediately meeting that need. So we would think that A would be a better alternative here, because when the child has that need in that particular setting, we want to meet it right away. So recess is often something that's deferred to a time later, and at this point in the game, we would probably not try to ask Ronnie to wait for that. We want to meet that need right now. Asking to meet with the teacher just quickly wouldn't meet the need, correct? Because we're looking at someone who would be seeking adult attention, teacher attention, and reading independently wouldn't be really an appropriate replacement behavior for Ronnie at this point, because he's really not trying to avoid working in the group. He's trying to gain his peer attention. So, and most of our listeners correctly answered A. Okay. So let's do one more of these. When asked to work with her lab group in science, Quinn whines, refuses to do her share of the work. The FBA indicates that the function of behavior is to avoid peer attention. So we'll give you a minute to answer this. Which is the best replacement behavior for Quinn?
A and C. Most are A and D. Most people chose D.
Okay, so which is the replacement one? So most of our listeners chose D, that she would ask to work on her lab alone at her desk. Does it serve the same function as the problem behavior? It does, because it would allow her to avoid peer attention. Is it easier to do than the problem behavior? Again, it's a one-step process, a child asking, so we think that would probably be more efficient and is socially acceptable, absolutely, certainly within a school and classroom environment. Just looking at the other ones quickly, allowing her to work with her choice of peers is obviously counterproductive because she's trying to escape their attention. Requesting adult support, again, wouldn't be particularly productive because it goes to someone who might be seeking adult support and attention. Asking to work with a peer tutor, again, is gaining peer attention, although it might be with one individual peer. And the last one, requesting an easier task. Again, we're not thinking about a child here, Quinn, who's work avoidant, but rather doesn't want to work with her peers. She's trying to avoid peer attention. So the correct answer would be B. Okay. So,
Just to wrap up.
okay, you want to wrap up?
Sure. Okay, just going to wrap up quickly here. Key points that we would like you to walk away with are that function-driven behavior intervention plans are really about replacing problem behavior by teaching socially acceptable, efficient behaviors that allow students to obtain the payoff or the function of what they were after in the first place. What we also want to make sure, though, is that we are not just looking to replace the problem behaviors, but that we're looking to prevent them from occurring in the first place. So we would do that by directly addressing the triggers or the antecedents, and we would also be prompting replacement behaviors. We have to look at the consequence strategies, and what we're going to do is reinforce replacement behaviors, and we are going to reduce the payoff for the problem behaviors. So we have a few minutes left, and we're wondering if there were any questions. Just encourage you to, what's that?
We can address some of these.
Okay.
I can try to be sure.
Oh, okay. So one question that came in was, how can parents be sure that teachers are correctly implementing a behavior intervention plan? That's a great question, and yes, absolutely. Well, the first and the easiest reply to that question would be, well, is the plan working? If the plan's working, then chances are the teachers are implementing it correctly. But the things that we haven't gotten into in this training is that we're just teaching you the skills of actually creating a behavior intervention plan. We also need to look at the systems that will be in place, and we absolutely need to look at the data, and we need to look at the evaluation. Those are all things that the school must be responsible for, just as they would with anything that they teach. If we're teaching students long division, we absolutely are going to go back and we're going to look at the data. We're going to see how many students have mastered this skill and how many haven't. And that's just what we do in education. So if you're feeling that the behavior intervention plan is not effective, and if you've already gone through that period of time where you're going to see that spike in behaviors, which would be expected or natural, if you've already gone through that period and it's still not working, parents should always feel free to request a team meeting and ask to see the data and to explore what's going on. Let's see, another question. If schools see a pattern in their FBAs and BIPs, do they look at the broader environment changes to improve outcomes for all students? That's a wonderful question, and absolutely. Schools who are implementing PBIS with fidelity are always engaged in this process. Again, PBIS schools will have a leadership team that meets weekly. Some schools meet weekly, some schools meet every other week, but they're constantly looking, and they do have a data system in place that allows them to look at behaviors in terms of the whole school, the congregate data, is that the right word? Where you can look at time of day, you can look at environment, you can look at grade levels, you can look at individual students. It's all about those systems being in place where you are absolutely looking to identify where are our weak spots, where are the places where most kids are struggling the mightiest, and then you would put extra supports in place. Not surprisingly, what we see is cafeteria, lunchtime, playground, school arrivals, and school dismissals are those times when we're seeing most of the problematic behaviors happening. And good schools that are implementing positive behavior supports would absolutely look to improve the behavioral supports available in those settings or at those times of day. You want to take a stab at one of these questions, Ken?
Sure. Yeah, so one of our questions is about, that often consequences of school often involve punishment and taking privileges away from kids. And does the FBA BIP process tell us about these approaches? And that's absolutely true. Really, anytime we do functional behavior assessment in the BIP, the purpose of the BIP is always to identify alternative behaviors that we can reinforce. So it's really been a very effective tool, actually, for us who work on the BEST team and the PBIS team to coach personnel in school to really move away from punishment or negative kinds of consequence activities when they're dealing with an undesirable behavior, and instead what we're always talking about is what can you reinforce the child for doing. So by doing a BIP, you come up with alternative behaviors. You're always identifying behaviors that have a positive payoff for the child, and all of our emphasis in any behavior plan that we build after doing a functional behavior assessment is around helping the child get their need met in a more socially appropriate way. And all of our strategies are really geared toward reinforcing the child and having them have some positive payoffs for changing the behavior and substituting a different behavior. So it's been a wonderful tool for us to really actually coach personnel in schools, teachers and school staff around more positive interventions, and it's absolutely built into as a part of this process. One other quick question here. So some BIPs use tokens or other rewards, and kids seem to become reliant on those awards. Thoughts about how best to use those types of award systems? You know, this is very commonly one of the questions that we deal with any of our schools that are implementing PBIS. And the purpose of using rewards, or actually we try to use tokens often, is that it's a way in which we can actually capture and help the adults capture some data on how much they're actually reinforcing and noticing positive behaviors that kids demonstrate. So it's really about having a way in which we can tally and quantify adult response. So, and we really need to also be cognizant of that and approach that in the same way when we build a behavior intervention plan. We need to look at it from the lens of that what we're really doing, if we use tokens, is that that it may feel rewarding to some extent to a child, but what we really want to focus on is that it's a way for us to help quantify and identify when the adults are actually noticing that behavior and improve their frequency of reinforcement. What we've recognized also and found out from doing PBIS now for several years is that, you know, we always end up having to over time phase and change up some of the criteria for which kids receive tokens and reinforcement, and that needs to be built into any kind of a good behavior intervention plan where we're shaping behavior over time. And the you know, our goal is always to wean kids off of that kind of token reinforcement, have them motivated by the other positive, naturally occurring kinds of consequences that happen when kids are in class and on task and getting their work done. And over time, if we fade our token and our more artificial kind of reinforcement system effectively, we find that that works really well, and kids start doing and demonstrating positive behavior in school for all the right reasons.
One more question, and then we're going to need to wrap up. Question was about school districts seeming to have just one behavior analyst for the whole district, and that and yet it seems like there are many more behavior intervention plans that get created without input from that analyst or without a full assessment. So what I want to say is that I truly hope that we see a change in that trend. I don't think we're going to see school districts hiring more and more analysts, but what I do think we're going to see is 600 professionals that have now been trained in every region of our state to implement more practical FBAs. And I see that number just growing because we, you know, starting up with 600 people in this state isn't bad for year one of implementation. And the more people that learn this easy and effective and efficient process, I think we're going to see it catching fire. The other thing I just want to say is that I just don't think we have any business creating a behavior intervention plan that isn't guided first by an FBA. That just simply has not been supported by the research. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this webinar. This webinar will be archived on Vermont Family Network's website, along with many other previously recorded webinars. So be sure to visit VFN's website at www.vermontfamilynetwork.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars, workshops, and support groups. Have a great day.
Okay.